I'm Charlotte Allen. I'm a veteran journalist. I've written for practically every conservative and liberal publication that I can think of, from the Atlantic Monthly to the LA Times to the Wall Street Journal to the Weekly Standard, where I write quite a bit.
Well, thanks for being with me today, Charlotte. As everyone on Blogging Heads knows, I'm Kevin Glass. I'm the Director of Policy at the Franklin Center. And I wanted to have Charlotte to come on here and talk about a piece that I read by her in the USA Today about Donald Trump. And the piece is called Why a Stanford Grad Joined the Trump Revolt. And I know on Blogging Heads, kind of on the site, generally there's a little bit of a paucity of pro-Trump opinion. So I wanted to have Charlotte on, discuss this piece with me. So Charlotte, why are you a Trump supporter, and what kind of drove you to discuss this in the USA Today?
Well, I've been a kind of a Trump supporter as a Trump supporter entertainment personality person, because I used to be a real fan of The Apprentice, which I watched for several years. I got a little tired of the format, but I always thought Trump was just great, and I thought that he treated the apprentices very well. He had his standard line, "You're fired," but it was always a kind of friendly thing. And so I was very impressed, and I was impressed with the business advice, the advice he gave to young people starting out, as how to succeed in business, how to be a pleasant, marketable personality. And he had a great sense of humor. So when he started up his campaign last year, sometime in the middle of 2015, I was reading him for entertainment, because he just was head and shoulders above all of the other candidates in his ability to really draw a crowd. He went to Iowa when Hillary Clinton went, and Hillary was delivering some serious, very serious speech. And Trump landed with his helicopter and started inviting kids at the Iowa State Fair to give rides to them. So I thought that was just hilariously funny. I didn't quite take him seriously as a candidate. I was kind of supporting Scott Walker back then. But then I realized that Trump actually stood for a lot of things that I really believe in. And one of them is his stand on immigration, which I think is so important. We're now importing 400,000 illegal immigrants into America. Under President Obama, we virtually have no borders, scarcely any border enforcement. It's very difficult to deport people for being illegal. And we've had just off and on highly publicized crimes, violent crimes committed by immigrants, so that they're not only driving down the wages of U.S. citizen employees, or preventing them actually from getting the jobs, because so many of those immigrants work for contractors who basically then make a contract with the head contractor on whatever, say, the construction site is. So that Americans never have a chance to get those jobs or even learn about them. So this was a great concern. But also we've got these crimes, we've got drunk driving. We basically have a sort of lawless situation that I believe Victor Davis Hanson has described in California's Central Valley, where you have people come here illegally, and basically they start living in the kind of scofflaw way that they've lived in the south of the border countries where they come from, where they're throwing their trash on the highway, they're running restaurants out of their homes, they're without any sort of safety or food safety oversight. They're just doing things and getting into kind of minor trouble with the law constantly. So you have this culture. So I think that Trump's stand on immigration, build a wall and keep them out, I think that's a great policy. I think it's something we have to do to protect American jobs and American wages. And his stand on trade makes sense. Free trade sounds great in theory, as I explained in my article. And when you're reading Adam Smith, it just sounds wonderful. The British exporting woolen goods to Portugal, Portugal exporting wine to Britain. Well, that sounds just perfect, except that the trade agreements we get into are with countries that basically have their fingers on the scale, their thumb on the scale. They're paying rock bottom wages. They're devaluing their currency, manipulating their currency. And so basically we have a situation, it's a trade situation that's basically out of control. And you have a horrible, I mean, so, we have jobs just disappearing, factories closing monthly. We have the Chinese, of course, using our massive trade deficit to basically invest in America, which means buying up American companies. So Trump just makes sense from a policy ground. So I found him not only an entertaining figure and someone who is willing to be constantly politically incorrect, which I think Americans find a great relief, but somebody who has really good, substantial policies. So that's
all right. So there's a lot to go through there. But first, I guess I want to start with, you said under Obama, we essentially have no borders, and there are lots and lots of immigrants. And, he's not particularly, in your view, enforcing immigration law as he should be. But do you think that that's any different than it was under previous presidents? I mean, under George W. Bush, under Bill Clinton. President Bush famously, worked with Congress to try and pass a fairly large, comprehensive immigration reform bill that a lot of people denigrated as amnesty and kind of a way of allowing the people who have come here illegally to stay here legally. So do you think that, you said kind of in your view in the Obama era, our border has been uniquely porous, but do you see that as having been worse than in previous eras?
Well, strangely enough, I mean, it's probably worse. It's obviously worse because there's now, I believe, according to Obama's most recent executive orders, there's basically no effort to deport anyone except for people who are convicted of serious crimes, and even they often don't get deported, or they manage to come back, or whatever. So it is substantially worse now. But I agree. I mean, George W. Bush's strategy, of course, was this round of amnesty. I mean, I don't see what is wrong with calling it amnesty, because that's basically what it substantially was. His plan, which failed, and fortunately, then we have the Gang of Eight, which is more Republican policy, Republican and Democratic policy, which again is another effort to legalize the status of 11 million people here illegally. So we've had porous borders for a long time. We've obviously, the only people who have been serious about enforcing the borders are border agents, but they're understaffed. It's easy to get across the border through a number of ways, get through the fences. So of course, our policies haven't been different. But here's somebody who says, well, let's have different policies. How about that? For the first time in maybe 30 years? It's been quite incredible, because back when Reagan, under some pressure, because Reagan was opposed to the idea of amnesty back in the 1980s, but he gave into pressure because there was a promise that there would be very strong border enforcement. So he said, okay, back then, 30 years ago, there were 3 million illegal immigrants. Now the number has practically quadrupled. So we've had some really bad policy. And of course it's hurt Americans. I mean, I grew up in America, and I remember in my youth and up until relatively recently, maybe 20 or so years ago, every construction site you went to or passed on the sidewalk was staffed entirely by American-born construction workers. Now what's happened, you hardly see anyone who could conceivably be born in America unless they grew up speaking Spanish. It's the only language you hear on the sites. All of the crews who come by, I live in a townhouse co-op, and all the crews who come by to do the landscaping, all obviously very recent immigrants, and I doubt whether very many of them are legal. So something has happened over the last 30 years that Trump would like to reverse, to give those jobs, those blue-collar jobs, back to Americans.
So another thing I wanted to kind of bring up, you mentioned immigrants kind of not assimilating in America in maybe the same ways that previous waves of immigrants have. And I can't really speak to that, but you said, Trump talked about higher crime rates of immigrants, especially of illegal immigrants. But a lot of people have disputed those numbers, and these might be kind of from sources that you don't perceive as particularly trustworthy. But I know the Wall Street Journal recently wrote about how, well, they did a kind of roundup of studies of immigrant populations showing that immigrant populations, both legal and illegal, and kind of regardless of geography. So no matter if they're from India or China or El Salvador or Mexico, don't actually commit crimes at higher rates than native-born Americans. So I guess I'm a little confused as to where Trump is getting his numbers, but if you don't place much stock in, what the Wall Street Journal is saying, and you place more stock in what Donald Trump is saying. But it doesn't seem like, and at least from my perspective, I haven't been particularly convinced by anything that I've read on the crime rates. Well, you mentioned, maybe they're not assimilating in ways that previous waves have assimilated, and that might be a problem, but I don't see the crime connection here.
Well, I would say this. I mean, for one thing, I'm not as familiar with that Wall Street Journal study as you are, but I have read something about it. And it does conflate both legal and illegal immigrants, so that you have, middle class people coming from India or even Latin America for that matter. I mean, I'm the daughter of a middle class immigrant family on my mother's side, of people who are law abiding, work hard. So of course their crime rate is going to be low. So, but I think that there are statistics showing that huge numbers of inmates in California prisons are illegal immigrants, and that's immigrants from Latin America. So I mean, those are the statistics that I'd like to look at. And then you have these egregious cases, like soon after Trump speaks, and everybody in the liberal media and at the Wall Street Journal is saying how stupid, or how inflammatory, how racist to attribute high crime rates to illegal immigrants. And then you have something like that young woman in San Francisco who's shot by a multiple deportee, who's killed by a multiple deportee. You have incidents like that just constantly cropping up. And sure, you can say, well, those are highly publicized because the perpetrator was an illegal immigrant. And what about all the cases of American on American crime, maybe in our inner cities? But those cases do stand out. So I think that the Wall Street Journal is being a little bit unfair there, because it didn't separate out legal versus illegal immigrant crime rates.
Right. I know, it is really hard to separate some of that out, because obviously, the illegal immigrant population is not well tracked by law enforcement or by the census. And often, when someone is stopped and they're here illegally, the crime is that they're here illegally. And I know a lot of studies have had difficulty separating that out. I think, and again, like I said, I just haven't been convinced by anything saying that the illegal population is committing crimes at higher rates. And it could be, like you said, there are a lot of cases where it does happen, and it might be that it's kind of more morally offensive to us that if we have a border and we should be securing it and we're not, and then an illegal immigrant commits a crime, particularly a violent crime, that should make us more morally outraged than if a member of the native-born population does that. But like I said, I haven't seen the numbers there to justify the Trump argument. But I wanted to kind of ask you, I guess, So obviously Trump has made immigration, securing the border, his number one above all issue in this election. But do you see any policy difference between Donald Trump and Ted Cruz? I mean, Ted Cruz has been talking, ever since he became a national political figure about securing the border and about the importance of that. I remember I saw him at a conference a couple years ago when the Gang of Eight stuff was going on, and he was talking about how, that was something that he would never be on board with, that he thought securing our border and, enforcing our immigration laws was a lot more important than doing any kind of path to legalization. So I wanted to know if you see any policy difference, I guess, between Donald Trump and right now Ted Cruz is kind of the only serious contender left against him, and why, Donald Trump convinces you a little more on these border issues.
Well, I think for one thing, I agree that Ted Cruz, at least up until he became kind of the darling of the Republican establishment, had a very similar position to Trump's on immigration enforcement. It was a top priority, and for a long time, my position was that if Trump didn't make it, I'd certainly go for Cruz. I think, but that was when, of course, you had big time amnesty supporters, or at least former supporters, or at least soi-disant former supporters, such as Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush, being the establishment favorites. They were getting all the money. They were getting the ads. So that was my position up until fairly recently, when, of course, Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio dropped out, and then Cruz, being the second strongest contender, became the establishment favorite. But this concerns me, because I think that the Republican establishment, especially the big donors, especially the Chamber of Commerce, is very much in favor of pretty much open borders, and so and they're the ones who are now they're throwing their money now at Cruz, and it's impossible for me to imagine that Cruz is going to be able to withstand that pressure to change his positions. And secondly, I would say that although Cruz has been very strong on immigration enforcement, he has not been strong on trade. He's been pushing this Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement in Congress, and there's no sign that he's stepped back on that. And I think, for example, just supporting that fast tracking means that Congress will never have a chance to discuss the nuances of a trade agreement that's basically being negotiated in secret. And so we're going to get this take it or leave it proposal. And I think that Cruz, that really has turned me off Cruz. It's not quite so important an issue to me, although it's certainly an important issue in terms of closed factories in America, and basically most industry kind of moving out of America. It's not as important an issue to me as the immigration issue. So as you say, for a long time I was supporting Cruz. Now I can't say that I'm supporting him at all. I'm just kind of sitting back and watching what's happening. My extremely strong support for Trump remains, but now Cruz isn't exactly my second choice.
So I guess just first to clarify, I'm fairly certain Ted Cruz always opposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership bill in Congress, and I'm someone who is more on the pro-free trade side of the Republican Party, and that a lot of the kind of Republican opposition to that was a little disappointing to me, to be upfront about that. But I'm fairly certain Cruz did oppose the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and he was kind of staunch on that from the beginning. I know a couple Republicans weren't always, but the issue of trade, and I find this fascinating because, like I said, I've been kind of always on the free trade side of the Republican Party. Do you and obviously Donald Trump has pushed that issue along with immigration to the front of the argument right now. Have you been kind of historically disappointed with a lot of the Republican stance on trade? I mean, Ronald Reagan was a big proponent of trade. Obviously, the Republicans in Congress in the 90s helped with NAFTA. George W. Bush opened up a bunch of trading markets. So this, to me, and I might be denigrated as a sellout establishment Republican, but this to me has always been kind of a mainstream Republican position to be generally in favor of a lot of free trade agreements. Is that something that you've always kind of raised your eyebrows at and maybe been disappointed that, because on both sides of the aisle there's a fairly strong kind of pro-free trade consensus, is that something that has always disappointed you, and Trump is maybe one of the first politicians in a long time to be a prominent kind of skeptic of a lot of these free trade agreements?
Well, I think what's happened is, of course, back in the 90s, free trade seemed like a good idea. And there was a lot of worry, though, about the displacement of American workers. But the idea was that they would easily, that their low quality jobs, that they could substitute for those low quality jobs, higher quality, higher paying jobs, just by maybe going through some retraining. There was just a flurry of interest in that, of people having multiple careers. You'd read a lot of op-eds about that. So we were told, well, not to worry. And the whole idea of free trade, of course, I've been a Republican for decades after a brief flirtation with liberalism when I was in college, because everybody else was a liberal.
Right.
And so I've always sort of assumed that free trade was something that would work out for everybody would benefit from free trade. So it didn't really bother me that much until I started seeing this enormous displacement of American workers, and not just in the working class, but among middle class people too. And I think it's going to be accelerated as white collar jobs become outsourced, along with blue collar jobs. Or we have, and I don't know if this is a trade or an immigration issue, it's probably a bit of both. We have the H-1B visa program, bringing in workers mostly from India, I guess, into tech jobs, working clearly at lower wages. They're classified as working at lower wages, not too bad wages. So it took me a good, I don't know, maybe 10 years to see what was happening, the kind of devastation of the American working and middle class that's ongoing. Now we're reading about, there's not going to be very much need for lawyers. You probably are familiar with the work of George Mason University economist Tyler Cohen in his book, Average is Over. And average certainly does seem to be disappearing. We're just seeing a middle class that's basically in the process of dying out. And those knowledge jobs, or the higher level jobs that Americans that would be assumed to be doing, just haven't materialized for many people. So again, it was one of those things that at the beginning, I, as a Republican, thought, well, trade is good, the more the better, and certainly trade is good. There's nothing wrong with trade per se, but when you see the kind of arrangements we make with low-wage countries that don't care a bit about basically exploiting their workers, making them work, 14 hours a day, of making minimal wages compared to what Americans would earn, the outsourcing of good old American institutions like the Ford Motor Company into Mexico, then this has come to really bother me quite a bit, because I guess I'm a patriot. I love my country.
Yeah, so I think you're right that a lot of the people who are pro-free trade, a lot of the economists who are pro-free trade, the politicians, this is almost universally true, that they undersell the costs of trade agreements and all of these free trade deals. So, it might be the case that we do lose jobs to China or Mexico or some other location, and it might be a couple hundred, it might be a couple thousand, but there are definitely costs to free trade. That doesn't mean there aren't benefits, and I think that at least by and large, a lot of these trade agreements have come out ahead on the cost-benefit analysis, but definitely politicians and kind of the political establishment have undersold the costs to trade. And actually, I think a really interesting part of this is a lot of, and this is, we can denigrate, ivory tower eggheads, a lot of economists kind of assume the transition costs to going to a new economy, less manufacturing, more knowledge and service based, like you said, that the transition costs are almost negligible. But it turns out that, it's hard to tell someone who's lost their manufacturing job in the Midwest, well, what you need to do, is pack up, leave your town and move to Tennessee or the Sun Belt or Arizona where there are jobs for you. And to an economist, that obviously makes sense, and to the academics and maybe politicians, but to the actual manufacturing workers who lose out in some of these free trade agreements, it's hard to say, the transition costs that you're concerned about don't matter. So I think there are certainly political fixes that need to address some of these problems, but I do think this fairly large wave of anti-trade sentiment would be, and especially some of the specific policies that Donald Trump wants to propose, import tariffs, would be kind of disastrous for the American economy. And to take an example, President Obama earlier in his term had a little experiment with steel tariffs. And we saw, manufacturing decline. We saw the prices climb. And so that, to me, was kind of a test case for a lot of the policies that Donald Trump is proposing. And while it's nice to think, we can bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S., I'm not sure that implementing some of what he's talking about would be all that effective.
Well, the problem is that, before the early 90s, we had tariffs, and the economy seemed to be doing awfully well during the 1980s, for example. So I'm not sure that tariffs are such a bad idea. We had them throughout most of the 20th century when the American economy basically was on a pretty upward swing, except for, I suppose, the Great Depression of the 1930s, but certainly after World War II. So I'm not sure that tariffs necessarily mean economic death. And I would also point out that, yes, there have been benefits of free trade in the form of cheaper goods. Your cell phone might cost more, although it's hard to say how much more. But when you can't get a job that will enable you to support a family, then I think that, or even two jobs that will enable two people to support a family, then I think that the benefits are negligible, if any. So I'm not so sure. I know that economists do tend to see everything, or so that sort of people can be moved around or move themselves around very easily to accommodate new realities. But I'm not sure that really takes place. You go to the Midwest, which used to be the sort of the American wholesome heartland, and you see the devastation. You see all the trailers and rundown trailer parks that surround every city in the Midwest, every town out in the country. You read about the lifestyles that people are leading now, the drugs, the aimlessness, and you have to say, well, this isn't solely the fault of people who have refused to move, because where do you move to? Yeah, there might be more jobs in Arizona, but at some critical mass point, there aren't going to be more jobs in Arizona, or there might be lower paying jobs. That why move? Say you worked at the Carrier air conditioning factory in Indiana, so you move to Arizona and maybe you can get a job. I don't know, working as a masseuse or a manicurist or whatever. That's not going to quite. That's not quite an incentive to move.
Sure. So one last topic I wanted to ask you about is you said you initially were a fan of The Apprentice. You were a fan of Donald Trump, the entertainment personality, before becoming a fan of Donald Trump, the politician. And a lot of people in the mainstream media, they bristle at Donald Trump's persona, at his personality, that he's brutish, that he's rude, that he's brash. And I wanted to ask you if any of that kind of bothers you in supporting someone for president, that, he doesn't talk like a traditional politician. He's ruder to his opponents. He kind of makes snide comments to the media about, his sexual history, about other people's families. And I wanted to ask you if any of that bothers you, or if you find it kind of a breath of fresh air.
Well, I basically do find a lot of Donald Trump a breath of fresh air, and I like his brashness and his bluntness, and I think the family war was basically started by a group of people who are basically, now they were aligned, I think, with Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush. Now they're aligned with Ted Cruz. And you can't tell me that Cruz didn't know that these people are on his side, because they're in constant contact with the conservative media. So I mean, that, you could say, well, maybe Trump shouldn't have gone quite as far as he did when he posted Heidi Cruz's photo after a photo of his wife. His wife made the rounds. But then on the other hand, politics is a rough game, and I basically like the way he's playing it, and he also can be very, very diplomatic and gentle. I've read, at least there was a story in Politico, that he's basically kind of made it up with Megyn Kelly, that she came up and the two of them had lunch together. I don't know whether this is a true story, but I think Politico is a fairly reliable source. So he's a guy, he's basically, I mean, I grew up in a family of lawyers, and lawyers are people who will just throw everything that they can at you in court, but then they're perfectly willing to have lunch or a drink with you afterwards. It's that's the way a lot of people in a lot of professions conduct themselves. So Trump's brashness doesn't really bother me at all.
All right, yeah. I mean, well, how about his, people have been combing through some of his, interviews with Howard Stern about his own sexual history, and that he's proud of it and he denigrates former partners. None of that bothers you either?
Well, I've got to say, I don't know a whole lot about that. So it would be impossible for me to comment. I mean, Trump is he's obviously been a magnet for women and has had beautiful wives and girlfriends. And he's had lots of kids. He's had 5 kids. So he must be sort of proud of his sexual achievements. And so I wish I could say more on that subject. And of course, I don't think he's been interviewing Howard Stern recently, but it's just,
no, this was like 10 years ago.
So. Back when he was not a political figure. So I mean, it strikes me as a little bit, what's the word? I mean, obviously it's going to offend some very, religious people, evangelical Christians, Mormons, obviously in Utah, who are very, straight-laced about such things. But it really doesn't bother me, as far as I can tell. He's been a great father, and he's got very accomplished children who attend top universities and start businesses. And Ivanka Trump is a real success, and he's got a very well-mannered little boy. So I don't, it's hard to say the crimes of 10 years ago, whatever they were, to hold that against him. I mean, obviously both the conservative press, which is very anti-Trump, and of course the liberals will dig up anything to throw at him. But I can't see this as serious.
All right, well, great. That's about all the time we have for today. Thanks a lot for coming on, Charlotte, and explaining kind of your perspective as a Trump supporter.
Yeah, well, thanks, Kevin. It's been a lot of fun.
Great, and I will see everyone else next time on Blogging.